You're watching a race that looks symbolic on the surface, but quietly decides who controls the next phase of human expansion. If China lands astronauts on the moon before the United States, it won't end with a flag in the ground. That moment would mark the beginning of something far bigger. Because this time, the goal isn't to visit the moon, it's to stay. And the first country to build a permanent presence, especially near the moon's south pole, could gain early control over the most valuable resources in space: water that can be turned into fuel, materials that can support construction beyond Earth, energy sources that could reshape industries back home. So this isn't a race about prestige anymore. It's about infrastructure, supply chains, and control. And if one side gets there first, the balance of power may start shifting long before anyone realizes it. Not the same race. You're watching something that looks familiar on the surface. Rockets, countdowns, astronauts preparing for the moon. It feels like history repeating itself. Another space race. Another symbolic finish line. But that assumption is exactly where things start to break apart. Because this time, the mission doesn't end when the astronauts come home. Back in the 1960s, the goal was simple: get there first, prove it, and leave. The United States sent 12 astronauts to walk on the moon, planted flags, collected samples, and returned safely to Earth. And then it stopped. No permanent presence. No infrastructure. No long-term system built to stay. The race was about prestige, and once that was secured, the urgency disappeared. But what you're seeing now operates under a completely different logic. Today, returning to the moon is no longer about a moment. It's about building a system that keeps running long after the landing is over. Space agencies are no longer asking, "Can we reach the moon?" They're asking, "Can we live there? Can we operate there? Can we scale beyond it?" And that shift changes everything. Because once the objective becomes staying instead of visiting, the moon stops being a destination. It becomes a platform, a launch point, a piece of infrastructure in a much larger network that extends deeper into space. Missions are no longer isolated events. They are steps in a chain, each one designed to support the next. But this was just the beginning of the shift. Technology has quietly reached a point where this kind of system is possible. Robotics can prepare landing sites before humans arrive. Autonomous systems can operate in extreme conditions for long durations. Private companies can now build components that once only governments could afford. And the cost of launching payloads into space has dropped significantly over the past decade, opening the door for sustained operations rather than one-time missions. And it wasn't just the technology that changed. The mindset changed with it. You're no longer looking at a race for a symbolic victory. You're looking at the early stages of something that starts to resemble an economy. Resources, supply chains, transportation routes, energy systems, all of it beginning to take shape beyond Earth. And in that kind of environment, timing matters in a completely different way, because the first country to arrive under this new model doesn't just win a moment. They start building a system that others may have to follow. Then the question stops being who lands first and becomes who builds faster. China moves quietly. You're watching a program that rarely makes noise, but keeps moving forward anyway. No dramatic announcements, no constant spotlight. And yet, mission after mission, China keeps getting closer to something much bigger. At first glance, it looks slow, careful, almost cautious. But that's exactly what makes it dangerous. Because every step China takes is part of a sequence that doesn't break. It starts with robotic missions, orbiters, landers, rovers, each one designed to prove a single capability: landing precision, surface mobility, sample collection. Then comes one of the most critical milestones: bringing material back from the moon. The Chang'e 5 mission successfully returned lunar samples to Earth, making China only the third country to ever do it. That moment wasn't just scientific, it proved something deeper. It proved that China could complete the full-cycle launch, land, operate, and return without relying on anyone else. A closed system, end-to-end. And once that system works, scaling it becomes a matter of repetition. But this was just the beginning of the pattern. Each mission feeds directly into the next. There are no gaps, no resets, no dramatic shifts in direction, just steady progression toward a clearly defined goal, putting humans on the moon and keeping them there. And it's that consistency that starts to build pressure. Because while others are still adjusting timelines and redesigning systems, China continues executing, testing new landing technologies, improving navigation systems, expanding deep space communication networks, quietly solving problems before they become public setbacks. Then comes the bigger move. Plans for a permanent lunar research station begin to take shape, what China calls the International Lunar Research Station. Not a temporary base, not a short-term mission, a long-term presence designed to support continuous operations on the moon's surface. And it wasn't just about going alone. China starts building partnerships, inviting other countries to join the project, offering access, collaboration, shared infrastructure, slowly forming a network that could operate independently of Western-led programs. That's where the strategy becomes clear. This isn't about rushing to be first in a dramatic sprint. It's about reaching the finish line with a system already in place. Because when you move step by step like this, every success compounds. Every mission reduces uncertainty. Every test brings the next phase closer to reality. And that creates a different kind of momentum. Not explosive, but relentless. Then came the realization that changes how you see this entire race. China isn't trying to impress anyone with a single moment. It's building something designed to last. And if that system reaches the moon before anyone else is fully ready, the advantage doesn't stay small for long. Because the moment they arrive, they won't be starting from zero. They'll already know exactly what comes next. But across the world, a very different strategy is unfolding. Artemis under pressure. You're looking at a program that promises more than anything that came before it. Bigger missions, longer stays, a permanent return to the moon. On paper, the Artemis program looks like the most advanced lunar effort ever designed. But the deeper you look, the more complicated it becomes. Because Artemis isn't a single mission. It's a system made up of multiple systems, all moving at the same time. The Space Launch System, one of the most powerful rockets ever built. The Orion spacecraft, designed to carry astronauts farther than any modern crew vehicle. The Lunar Gateway, a space station planned to orbit the moon. And the Human Landing System, built in partnership with private companies like SpaceX. Each piece is critical. Each piece depends on the others, and that's where the pressure starts to build. Because when one part slows down, everything else has to wait. The Space Launch System alone has faced years of delays and rising costs, with each launch carrying a price tag in the billions. Orion has completed test flights, but still requires further validation for sustained missions. The Lunar Gateway adds another layer of coordination, requiring modules from multiple partners to come together in orbit before it can function as intended. And it wasn't just engineering that complicated things. It was the structure behind it. Artemis operates through a network of contractors, private companies, and international partners. On one hand, that creates innovation, new ideas, rapid advancements in certain areas, but on the other, it introduces dependencies, different timelines, different priorities, different systems that all have to align perfectly for a single mission to succeed. But this was just the beginning of the strain, because every delay doesn't exist in isolation. It pushes the entire schedule forward. A missed milestone in one system affects launch windows, crew readiness, and mission sequencing across the board. And over time, those delays begin to stack. Then came the growing realization. The more ambitious the system becomes, the harder it is to move quickly, because Artemis isn't built for a single landing. It's designed for a long-term presence from the start, sustainable missions, reusable systems, infrastructure that supports future expansion. And while that vision is powerful, it also means more moving parts, more coordination, and more time before everything is fully operational. And it wasn't just about time, it was about competition. Because while Artemis continues to evolve, another program is moving forward with fewer variables, fewer dependencies, a more direct path to the surface. And that contrast begins to sharpen with every passing year. You start to see two completely different philosophies take shape. One prioritizes flexibility, innovation, and long-term scalability, but accepts complexity as the cost. The other prioritizes control, speed, and execution, reducing variables to maintain momentum. Neither approach is weak, but only one of them might arrive first. And that's where the tension begins to shift. Because if Artemis reaches the moon later than planned, even by a small margin, the consequences won't stay small. They'll start to compound. Because the moment another nation establishes a presence first, the entire dynamic changes. Location choices get locked in. Infrastructure begins forming. Systems start operating before others even arrive. And once that process starts, catching up becomes harder than anyone expects. Then the question stops being how advanced Artemis is, and becomes whether it can move fast enough to matter. Because in this race, timing doesn't reward perfection. It rewards whoever gets there and starts building first. First means control. You might think the race ends the moment boots touch the lunar surface. One nation lands first, plants a flag, and history records the winner. That's how it worked before. That's what most people still expect. But this time, landing first is only the opening move. Because the real competition begins after the touchdown. The moment a crew arrives on the moon, the question shifts from who made it to where did they land and what can they access. And that's where the entire race narrows down to one specific region, the moon's south pole. This area doesn't look dramatic from orbit. It's filled with craters, long shadows, and uneven terrain. But hidden inside those permanently shadowed regions is something that changes the entire equation. Water ice. Not traces. Not small amounts. Estimates suggest hundreds of billions of pounds of water ice could exist in these shadowed craters. That's enough to support sustained operations for years, possibly decades. To put that into perspective, launching a single gallon of water from Earth into space can cost thousands of dollars. You heard that right. Now multiply that by the amount needed to sustain astronauts, produce fuel, and support continuous missions, and the value of finding it locally becomes clear. But this was just the beginning of why the South Pole matters. Water in space isn't just for drinking. It can be split into hydrogen and oxygen, creating rocket fuel. That means spacecraft no longer have to carry all their fuel from Earth. They can refuel on the moon and travel farther, faster, and more efficiently. The moon stops being a destination and becomes a refueling station for deeper space missions. And it wasn't just about fuel. The South Pole also offers areas that receive near constant sunlight, making it ideal for solar power. That combination, water in the shadows and sunlight on nearby ridges, creates one of the most valuable environments beyond Earth. But there's a catch. There isn't much of it. These optimal landing zones are limited. Narrow strips of terrain that balance access to both sunlight and ice. And once those locations are occupied, access becomes more complicated for anyone arriving later. That's where the meaning of first starts to change. Because the first nation to establish a presence near these regions doesn't just gain access to resources, they gain positioning. They decide where infrastructure begins. They choose where landing zones are built. They influence how future missions navigate around those areas. But this was just the beginning of the advantage. Once infrastructure starts forming habitats, power systems, communication links, it creates a footprint that expands over time. Every new system connects to the last, strengthening control over that region. And the longer that system operates without competition, the harder it becomes to challenge. Then came the realization that shifts everything. You're not watching a race to land. You're watching a race to position. Because the first crew to arrive at the right place won't just be early. They'll be shaping the environment that everyone else has to operate within. And once those positions are taken, they don't open up easily. They become anchors for everything that follows. Which leads to the next question. What exactly are those resources worth once they're controlled? The real prize. You're standing on the surface of the moon, looking out across a landscape that seems empty, lifeless, almost worthless at first glance. No atmosphere, no oceans. No visible signs of energy or industry. It feels like a place you visit, not a place that gives anything back. But that perception is exactly what hides the real value. Because beneath that quiet surface sits a collection of resources that could reshape how everything in space operates. And once you understand what those resources can do, the entire race starts to make sense. The most immediate and valuable resource is water. Not because of survival alone, but because of what it can become. When you split water into hydrogen and oxygen, you create rocket fuel. That means every pound of water extracted from the moon can replace fuel that would otherwise have to be launched from Earth. And the difference in cost is staggering. Launching material into space costs thousands of dollars per pound. You heard that right. Now imagine replacing that entire supply chain with fuel produced directly on the moon. Missions that once required massive launches from Earth could instead refuel in space, cutting cost, complexity, and risk. But this was just the beginning of the shift. Because once fuel becomes available beyond Earth, distance starts to shrink. Traveling deeper into space becomes more practical. Missions to Mars, asteroid belts, and beyond no longer need to carry everything from the ground. They can move in stages, refueling along the way, and the moon becomes the first major stop in that system. Then comes the surface itself. Lunar soil, known as regolith, might look like dust, but it can be used as a building material. With the right processing, it can be turned into bricks, shielding, and structural components. That means habitats, landing pads, and infrastructure can be built directly on the moon without transporting heavy materials from Earth. And it wasn't just about construction. Buried within that soil are rare elements, including helium-3, a potential fuel for future fusion energy systems. While fusion technology is still developing, the presence of helium-3 on the moon introduces the possibility of a long-term energy source that could one day power entire systems back on Earth. That's where the stakes begin to expand. Because now, you're not just looking at supporting space missions. You're looking at resources that could feed industries, energy systems, and economies across planets. But this was just the beginning of the advantage. Because resources alone don't create power. The ability to extract them does. The first nation to develop reliable systems for mining, processing, and transporting these materials gains something far more valuable than the resources themselves. They gain control over how those resources are used, who gets access, how much it costs, and how quickly the system can scale. And that creates a compounding effect. Early extraction leads to early supply chains. Early supply chains lead to dependency. And dependency creates influence. Then came the realization that shifts everything again. This isn't about what exists on the moon. It's about who builds the system to use it first. Because once that system is in place, every mission that follows becomes easier for them and harder for everyone else. And that's where the race begins to accelerate in a completely different direction. Because controlling resources is one thing, but controlling the systems that move them changes everything. Infrastructure decides power. You've reached the point where resources alone stop being the story. Water, minerals, energy, potential, all of it matters. But none of it means anything without the systems that extract, process, and move those resources across space. Because in this race, infrastructure is what turns potential into control. The moment a nation begins building permanent systems on the moon, the entire environment starts to change. Landing sites become hubs. Habitats become operational centers. Power systems extend range. Communication networks connect everything together. And slowly, what once looked like an empty surface starts functioning like an organized network. But this was just the beginning of the shift. Because infrastructure doesn't sit still. It expands. A single landing zone evolves into multiple pads. A temporary habitat grows into a semi-permanent base. Energy systems scale to support longer missions, and with each new addition, the system becomes more capable, more reliable, and harder to compete with. And it wasn't just about growth. It was about positioning. The first infrastructure built in the right location, especially near resource-rich regions like the South Pole, creates a kind of anchor. Every new system connects back to it. Every mission relies on it. And over time, it becomes the center of operations in that area. That's where the advantage starts to compound. Because once infrastructure exists, it begins to reduce cost and increase speed for the side that built it. They can land more frequently, operate longer, expand faster. While others still have to plan missions from Earth, they're already working from the surface. Then came the effect few people talk about: dependency. Future missions from other countries, private companies, or international partners may find it easier to rely on existing systems rather than build entirely new ones. Communication networks, navigation support, refueling access, power sharing. The more advanced one system becomes, the more attractive it is to use, and that creates influence without force. Because when others start depending on your infrastructure, you begin shaping how operations happen. You influence standards. You affect access. You set the pace of expansion. But this was just the beginning of the leverage, because infrastructure also controls movement. Transport routes between Earth orbit, the Moon, and deeper space start forming around existing systems. Supply chains begin to follow predictable paths, and whoever controls the key nodes in that network gains control over how efficiently everything moves. That's when the comparison to Earth becomes impossible to ignore. Ports, railways, oil pipelines. The nations that built and controlled them didn't just move goods, they shaped economies. And now, you're watching the early version of that system being built beyond Earth, because once infrastructure reaches a certain scale, it doesn't just support missions, it defines them. And anyone arriving later doesn't get a blank slate. They enter a system that's already running. Which leads to the final shift, the moment where this race stops being about the Moon entirely and starts redefining power itself, power beyond Earth. You've followed the race from launches to landings, from resources to infrastructure. And now, the final shift comes into focus. Because what happens on the Moon doesn't stay on the Moon. It starts reshaping power back on Earth. At first, it looks distant, technical, something happening far above everyday life. But the moment one nation begins operating a stable system beyond Earth, the influence begins to ripple outward. Because leadership in space doesn't stop at exploration, it turns into control over standards. Who defines how resources are used? Who decides how close missions can operate to each other? Who sets the rules for mining, transport, and access? These aren't abstract questions. They're decisions that shape how every future mission functions. And those decisions don't come from theory. They come from whoever is already there. But this was just the beginning of the shift. Because once one system becomes operational first, others don't start from zero. They adapt around it. Allies align with existing infrastructure. Partner nations join the system that offers access. Private companies build technologies that fit into the dominant network. And slowly, one framework begins to spread beyond its origin. And it wasn't just about cooperation. It was about influence. Because the more nations rely on a single system, the more that system begins to guide behavior. It shapes agreements. It defines expectations. It determines who gets priority and who waits. That's when the balance starts to tilt. Not through conflict, but through structure. Then came the part that changes everything again. Because space isn't separate from Earth's economy anymore. The technologies developed for lunar operations feed back into industries on Earth. Energy systems, advanced materials, robotics, transportation. The side that leads in space begins accelerating in multiple sectors at once. And that advantage doesn't stay contained. It spreads. Economic strength grows. Technological leadership expands. Political influence follows. And what started as a race to the Moon begins reshaping global power in ways that aren't immediately visible. But the most important shift happens quietly. Because once a nation builds the first complete system beyond Earth resources, infrastructure, logistics, and partnerships, it doesn't just lead in space. It sets the direction for everything that comes next. Future missions won't ask where to begin, they'll ask how to fit in. And that's when you realize what this race was always about. It was never about reaching the Moon first. It was about deciding who builds the systems everyone else has to live with. And if China reaches that point before the United States, then the first footsteps on the Moon won't mark the end of the race. They'll mark the moment the next era of power quietly changes hands.